Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. We will begin our next session under the theme of STEAM Makes It Better. Our session chair is Professor Karina Millard. Professor Karina is a professor of physiology at the University of Gothenburg. She received her PhD from the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Auckland. Her research focuses in experimental perinatal brain damage. At a national level, she has served on the study section for the Swedish Research Council and on the study section for the Swedish Governmental Grants in Public Health. Her services have also been extended to international committees and boards such as the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology and the NIH. Professor Millard has received several accolades, including the Young Investigator Award from the Health Research Council in New Zealand and the Swedish Research Council Associate Professorship Award. Please welcome Professor Karina Millard.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here and to be invited. I would really sincerely like to thank the organizers, the FAS, for inviting me. It's been my first time in Kuwait, and it's been a very nice experience. And I must say, taken back from the meeting, I have been inspired, and I think I have so many new ideas I would like to take back to Sweden and try and introduce in our department. So I really would like to thank all the women who have spoken here and shown me the way how to go forward. So a very nice sort of introduction, inspiration for me to this subject. So what we will talk about in this session is how STEM can make things better. And I just thought to start off by giving a little bit of an example of my own journey. So I started off in Sweden. I'm Swedish by birth, and then actually moved around the globe, and I did studying and working in both New Zealand and Australia for over a decade, and then returned back to Sweden again. And I'm now, as the moderator here kindly introduced, I'm a professor in physiology, and I'm also a visiting professor at King's College in London. So I'm still working in an environment which I think most of you probably would consider quite easy environment compared to many of the inspirational stories that we heard about here today. But even so, we have actually selected the second female woman vice-chancellor at University of Gothenburg in a row. So we've had female woman leadership for 10 years, and now we just elected a new vice-chancellor just a couple of months ago, so we will have another term of female leadership of the university. So I think it shows that Sweden obviously has come quite a long way in allowing women to take the leadership roles. But I also like to give you some examples that things are certainly not perfect, and we can take these things further. So what I did was I looked up a little bit of statistics from my own department before I came here. And in Sweden, we have tried to really have an equal opportunity for sexes and gender and other type of sort of disabilities, for example, in children that we will hear about today, and other that type of thing that might discourage people to take on positions. But when I looked up our own statistics, I found that for the teaching staff, we have almost 60% of our permanently employed teachers are female. So we have 67 female women and 51 men. But if you actually look at the average salary in these categories, the men earn actually on average 20% more than the females. So this is also something I think that hasn't maybe been brought up, but something we need to think about, that even just a title and a position also doesn't mean equality in some other aspects. And I think equal pay should also be something that everyone should be considering. This can probably be explained partly by if you look at the distribution of male and female between different categories in the academia. So when I looked at these in our own department, we have 60% of the professors are male, and the rest are females. But if you go down one step to the lecturer level, it's actually only 15% men and the rest are female. So I think this really brings up the subject that we're going to hear more about today, where you lose the females on the way in the pipeline, that Viditya will talk about, I think, more later on. So even in a country as in Sweden, where you do seem, or most people seem to think that we have high equality between the sexes or gender, there are still more work to be done. So Viditya, I'm looking forward to your talk. You will talk about to plug the leaky pipeline, and I think that is exactly what this will address, and how important it is that we keep these women that come early on in their careers, and someone brought it up in the last session, that we can keep them on and actually allow them to come back, for example, after they've had a family and they've been married and have the children and all that. So there is a future career for them in the long term as well. We work in our department to try and help equality by working from the floor and up in many respects. So we have committees for equality where women are part of those committees in each department, and then those departments have representatives that goes up to the faculty board, so they have sort of a direct pipeline into the powerhouse, if you like, of the medical school. And that's a way of bringing sort of the idea of equality all the way from the floor and up all the levels. And now, of course, like I said, we have 2 vice-chancellors, and they've both been females, so it seems like it's going in the right direction. One thing I would like also to bring up is that we're working on is to broaden the equality concept a little bit, not just to affect women, but also relating to what we will hear here later by Professor Nagwa, is about disabled children. I mean, I'm working in pediatrics, I work with brain injury, so this is a subject close to my heart. And I think these children, like Professor Nagwa will talk about, can have inflict a stigma on women aspects. So I think that will also be very interesting to listen to your talk about this and bring another angle to everything. And finally, I also would like to echo the message by Professor Manal. You will speak on give it grit and never quit. And to me, that actually is my way to success. I think you have to be very determined to reach where you want to be, and do not give up. And I think this talk will be a great inspiration to us all and lead us and show us the way how to get better at STEM. So I'm very much looking forward to these talks, and please, Dr. Nagwa, I would like to let you start.
Thank you, Professor, for this introduction. Our next speaker is Dr. Nagwa Abdelmajid. Dr. Majid is a professor of human genetics and head of the Department of Research on Children with Special Needs at the National Research Center in Egypt. She holds a PhD in human genetics and is a senior geneticist at the Genetics Institute, Pasadena. She is the recipient of the L'Oreal UNESCO Award for Women in Science for Africa and Middle East. Dr. Majid is a member in the National Committee for Women in Science and Technology, member of the International Jury for L'Oreal UNESCO, and member in Gender Research in Africa into ICT for Empowerment. She is also the head of the Norway Child Brain Research Group. Please welcome Professor Nagwa.
Thank you. I think you have to put it full. Not to put it two. Only one.
Big slideshow. Back, and then click to go next.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for your comments, and I will speak today about the woman with disabled children and how she faces a stigma in the Arab country, especially in Egypt. I will talk about Egypt. and specifically, more specifically, not in Cairo. It is in the governorates. Still, there is a stigma for the mother who had a disabled child. And I think I want first to thank all the organizers for inviting me for this distinguished conference, and to say that I will take science to the non-scientific population. I will take it to the layman in a very simple way using the ICT. Maybe you will be astonished because I'm a geneticist, but I'm working in a specific clinic and in the lab. And in the clinic of special needs and human genetics, I face the problem with the mothers. Most of the mothers, not all, they are asking for help because either they are desperate, their husband go to another, to start another life, or divorced, or continued, and this is the fewer, especially from the governorates. I know that all the good science should be valid research and up-to-date, and the integrity of research, and the challenges here, very important that still the gender-related studies are not in the research, the research in the journals. It's very, very uncommon to find a research study on gender, especially from the Arab population. There is, here in Egypt, in my country, there is a gap in knowledge, and this gap followed by a gap in freedom and democracy. Even there were some ladies and women in the parliament, but I didn't feel that's what. So we should did some empowerment and build a better future for the woman. So the problem, first of the problem, is the lack of education. And if they are educated, there is lack of learning. If they are learned, there is a lack of education. And I think education is the only way to kill this ignorance, and to help the woman to be empowered on the family and on the culture, and then on the society, and followed by on the world. I used the ICT, the communication technology, to raise this woman. This is started by a project coming from the IDRS from Canada, and funded. And the head of all this project was Enika Baskins. And I got the part for the disabled, which is related to my work. And I finished this part, and I started the second part without help of fund to propagate what I did. I got some respondents from my clinic, from the Clinic of Human Genetics and Special Needs, and we started to do the empowerment through something. I will say first that Egypt, as a Mediterranean North African country, it has a pharaonic origin, as we all know, but the problem is the gene flow. The gene flow is coming from multiple countries and multiple diversity, from Ethiopians, Greek-Roman, Arab, and Turkish, and French, and English settlers. So we have to put this in our consideration. And Egypt is very popular, but maybe you will be astonished that it is now 102 million inhabitants. And I heard in the morning that it is 106, so it is becoming increased. In spite of this, the consanguineous marriage, which means that the father and mother are related to each other, is coming to up to 25 to 60%, which is very high. So the percentage among the Arab is very high in Sudan and in Yemen and Jordan and Iraq. These are the most higher, and Qatar. These have a very high consanguinity rate. And then still increase the consanguinity rate over time in some Arab countries, like Algeria, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Yemen, still rising. But on the other hand, it started to decrease in Bahrain and Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait, Palestine, and Tunisia, which is very important to follow because most of the disabled children are coming from consanguineous marriage. So Egyptian women suffer from various forms of stigma during marital and social events and schooling and employment even. And also I will add that where she married, they told me that we are good girls, we are good in the schools, we are good wives, and we are good mothers, but the culture denied and betrayed us and told us that we are the cause of the disability of our children, which is not true. As not all the genetic disease are coming from the mothers. So this is one part of the X-linked disorders, and most of the diseases I met with the mothers are not related to the mother at all, even if it is de novo or if it is due to both parents together, the father and the mother, and not the mother only. And so she has to know this, but she doesn't know. She is raised in a community that accusing the mother that she is the cause of the abnormal child. So there is a dehumanization and isolation after she had delivered the abnormal child. And the Egyptian women find themselves rearing disabled children and alone, and maybe she left her job and stay with the child because they need more care, and in addition to the emotional distress she faced. The community, this is very important, that it is commonly used expressions. I hear by myself when I go to their countries that the mother passed from mothers. This abnormality passed from the mothers, or born from mothers. So anyhow, accusing the mothers. So a gender marker of blame, serving this. It is therefore not surprising that these mothers feel angry and lonely and unbeloved by family and community. In this work, drawing on the case of ICT, mobile, handset, and website, we use the three. Supply in Egypt for mothers having children with a special need. The mobile phone to make an interconnection together to know that she is not alone. She has another woman with the same problem, and so started to feel that there is something in the world, not her alone. So this ICT give the mother some astonishing things. I was astonished. I'm not an ICT worker, but I learned a lot when I worked with my respondents. And when we give the mouse for the first time to one of the mothers, she was very happy and catch it like a child, and she doesn't want to leave it. she feels that she has some freedom. And so it was very astonishing, and we put it in our records that it is becoming some emotional for the mother to be improved. The role of ICT in curbing this stigma. We did a website which is very simplified, with some words of the genetic disorders and the pattern of inheritance and why, and not on scientific terms, but it is in Arabic words. And you can go to the English side. I put it in 2 sides. And even we put some idea about the proper parenting and parenting and norms and the milestones when the child started to walk, when the child started to cry, to love to see his mother, to know her. These are very important because some of the diseases of the children, one of them have autism, and this autism has no physical features, but has behavior abnormalities. So how to discover it in the first or the second year of life, this is very important to give it to the mother to ask for treatment early. The website was developed and enhanced our visibility, both as a network and as individuals with positive influence in our environments, even on me. And documenting, in the website, we put an area for documenting success stories, or even not success, to put the story of the mother, to have the feeling that she can put her story freely. And the language is simple, and the stories can be retold. This started to have a power of knowledge. At first, I forget to tell you that they refused at all to do anything, and even to interview with me and with my colleagues who are taking care of the project. But step by step, we told them that we want to listen, we want to hear, we want to help. Step by step, they started to see that we can help them, because they lost all the trust of the culture. They started to source, which is very important, and stored the information. And using some people working in the ICT, they are staying with the mothers. Each one has a shadow with working on ICT to help and to explain. Their knowledge empowerment them, and the support system they developed strengthened them. For many participants in this became life-changing experience. Not only did they start taking care of themselves, but they also started to reach out to their environments with new self-confidence, as they don't have knowledge in the start. They don't have knowledge to speak to you, because they are even staying with a child, and that's all what they do, and desperate. But after they go to the computer, they start to have knowledge, and they start to use it, to store and to use, which is very important. And then started some empowerment through this knowledge. As one of them, her daughter is about to marry, and the mother knows something about ovulation and about the cycles, and how she can plan for pregnancy. So the mother is very happy and started to speak with her daughter, explaining this to her, and feeling that she has some knowledge, and started the empowerment. And they started to take care of themselves. Before, I have one of them, she told me, I have infection, virus C, and I don't want to be treated. Why? because all the people, they dislike me, and even my family, they are fed up with my child, which is always fighting and always hyperactive. And so she lost her trust in the community. We start to begin to regain this to them. And the end result of this work is very fantastic. One of them is very rich and can create a reality by making an institute for children with special needs in Governorate, not in Cairo. In Cairo, we have a lot of this, but it's all very expensive. But this mother make it in Swiss, and with the construction of the new center to care of the children. This center is unique in Egypt because it is free of charge, and she start to take her respondents to work with her in this, and to let them, some of the doctors, to have how to do rehabilitation, how to do speech therapy. And this is it okay? Is it finished? Okay. This is, so now we start to change, and the change, they start to change themselves, but to diminish also the rate in which the disabilities occur. How? They start to refuse to marry a cousin, and to raise their voice that they don't want to have an abnormal child, unless we do a prenatal diagnosis to be sure. So from victims of stigma, these mothers have, through the use of ICT, and become changing agents, creating a more powerful future for themselves and for their children. Their children now grown up since 5 years, and they are better than the starting point with them. And what is very apparent in relation to ICT and gender equality and woman empowerment is that when gender assumptions and norms are not fully recognized for the barriers and opportunities they present, the ICT may reinforce existing inequalities. But when we showed how ICT tools and ICT environments can unveil and change normative barriers to increasing gender equality and woman empowerment, and can create a new spaces for expression and connection for special in the community. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Vidita Vaidya, a neuroscientist and professor at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. She has been a Wellcome Trust Senior Overseas Research Fellow and a Fellow of the Indian National Science Academy. Professor Vidita obtained her PhD in neuroscience at Yale University. Her research interests lie in the neuroscience of emotion and molecular psychiatry. Her work has garnered the prestigious Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award in Medical Sciences. She's currently a member of the Women in Science panel of the Indian Academy of Sciences and is passionate about working to expand the presence of women in STEM. Please welcome Professor Vidita.
So I want to say first a big thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this conference. Over the last 2 days, I've sat in the audience humbled, honored that I had the opportunity to listen to these amazing stories of resilience of women who have surmounted what seem like unstackably hard odds and fought and pushed against barricades. It was very interesting to listen to the analogy of the sand ceiling or mud ceiling in contrast to a glass ceiling. I walk away with so many stories that I hope to carry back to my country, and I hope in the next 10 minutes to tell you a little bit about what's happening within the Indian perspective. So I want to start by saying that in my title, I started off saying plugging a leaking pipeline, and that's a metaphor that people have used routinely over the years, and we constantly talk about tweaking the pipeline so that we can ensure that we don't see this sort of attrition of women from where they start in the sciences to the end. By the time you reach full professor, women are really dwindling in terms of numbers. I want to put forth the idea that maybe we want to rethink the entire hose. Is that not something we can think about? We've not been at the table originally when we put up systems of policy and administration. There weren't enough women there. And ever since post that, we've only tweaked and modified rules so that we allowed more women in. Perhaps we need to rethink them in their entirety. And that might have an impact not only in terms of diversity of women being represented in science, but possibly race, color, different abilities. We have a spectrum of issues in science with missing diversity and inclusiveness in science. So I want to talk about women in STEM disciplines from an Indian perspective. I want to talk about rediscussing how we talk about plugging the leak, and then also the importance of narratives of women in STEM. And some of the discussion in India got fueled to a very large extent by the image that you see on the right, which is actually the team that put the Mars orbiter mission from India into space very successfully. And this was on the headlines of newspapers and was all over the press because this was remarkably different from your average person's expectation of the engineers that drove that entire mission. This was a bunch of very successful Indian women engineers, and it brought the topic back to the mainstream media. But before I start, I should say that India is a land of contradictions. Any statement that you make is likely to be true for our country. We have had a very successful and very powerful Indian woman prime minister. We've had an Indian woman president. We have many women who lead corporations, but we also have amongst the world's worst records for how we handle our young unborn girls, many of whom do not actually get born to see the day. And our rates of sexual harassment and abuse are very high. So we are a land of contradictions where we have immensely successful women and women who don't even have a chance, a fighting chance at life, forget anything further. This image in many ways captures some of those contradictions because here you see in a sense a recognition from the media of the fact that women had made it to these positions and were actually driving a very successful mission of the Mars orbiter, which attracted so much attention in the press. And following that, for a period of time, there were articles upon articles on women, Indian women scientists, and why some of them have been successful, and why yet we have such a lacunae of women in science in India. And this image is something that we prepared for the Women in Science panel to say that in the face of Indian science also looks like this, because the stereotype is very strong, and it's usually an Indian male with gray hair and a mustache and a beard. That's pretty much the classical image of what you would think of when you thought of a scientist. The numbers over time have been growing in India. So if you look at women in STEM in India from 1975 all the way up to 2006, and there's been data post that as well, the numbers have grown. And if you look at the representation percentage-wise across the arts, sciences, engineering, and medicine, and you can see undergrad, masters versus PhD, while we do really badly in the engineering disciplines, on the others, there's at least a presence. You can see that amongst those who have access to education, when you have access to education, you're still seeing women entering the sciences, you're seeing them in medicine. But when you start looking at percentage representation of them in these major institutions, Department of Biotechnology, Indian Council of Medical Research, DAE, which is PINC, Department of Atomic Energy, which is the organization I work for, the presence dwindles. And this is, of course, total percentages. The minute you start looking at leadership positions, senior professors, it's down to barely the teens, if not lower. The numbers really drop off, and they drop off very, very steeply. And of course, this is something that people across the world talk about, because this is not only a problem for the Indian subcontinent, it's a problem internationally, which is why do we lose women consistently across time along the pipeline, where even though you might have a close to 50% exiting batch of women in PhDs in the life sciences, you drop down to 30% or 15% by the time you're looking at professorial positions. And there's been much written about this by social scientists, by people who study the sciences, and yet we've only been able to tweak this. We can only plug the leaks to a small extent. And perhaps it's because climate change or transformation is the hardest thing to achieve. And it's one of the things that requires multiple, highly complex factors where you have to have top-down regulation at the level of policy and bottom-up because you need to change the grassroots. You can have the top-down, but if it doesn't transform anything in the environment, it doesn't really change anything. You will not have people coming up. I want to discuss why we cannot talk about examining all of our current existent procedures from first principle. Why is it that when we talk about leaking pipelines, we only talk about fixing the leaks? Why not ask if the hose by itself is problematic in its first place? So when you talk about maternity leave, I would say that you need to match it with paternity leave, because unless you do that, you do not bring to the table the fact that a policy at that point in time is telling you that childcare is a solitary responsibility of the woman, of only one parent. And unless policy comes in discussing those two things simultaneously, maternity leave puts the burden on the woman, again, of taking long breaks in her career, not having that shared by her partner, such that the hits are distributed across two individuals, and then you have a fighting chance. The Indian government has a very progressive maternity leave policy. It has a fantastic return to science scheme, and yet we see attrition. And that's because we have no paternity leave policy truly to talk about, one that's about 15 days in contrast to 6 months for women. And that's because the two are not put on the table for discussion simultaneously. They're always topics that are separate in discussion. And I really feel that we need to bring that back, and that won't happen unless there are enough women in positions where they can bring these topics up. And it's in that sense, collectively, we get to the point. So we have to prevent manels, which is panels that decide things in terms of policy but have only men on them, and there are no women to represent an alternative voice. I also feel we need to measure impact. In science, we talk about measuring impact, and impact is a controversial issue of how do you measure the impact of an individual, how do you measure the impact of an institution. We need to incorporate measuring diversity and inclusion as a component of measuring impact of an organization. And if that's built into it and it's tied in eventually to funding, then institutions wake up and institutions notice, because it's directly hitting the bottom line in a sense. So tying funding of institutions to diversity, inclusion, daycare being mandated. This is not an official mandate within India. I'm not sure what it's like in the rest of the world. Some places, I know for Sweden, for example, has a very progressive policy on it. And it would be really good for us to learn from examples in different places, because if that was there, it would make it much easier at the time point when you have the hardest time hanging on and staying in there, because you're torn between looking after your child and also managing your career, because it's an untenable choice to force women to make. They will make the choice of their child. And it's an inevitable and natural choice, and it should not be a choice that is forced onto women because of the way our structures are put into place. So top down, there's a lot of discussion. What about the bottom up? How do we, as a community, start making some impact at the level of the individual or the grassroots? Organizations like the Women in Science panel, which I'm on, and the Indian Academy of Sciences put together a book called Lilavati's Daughters, which describes the stories of 100 women scientists from India, spanning all the ages, all levels. And it's an interesting attempt to get stories out to potential readers, some who may be scientists, some who may be non-scientists. A condensed version of that got converted into something called the Girl's Guide to a Life in Science that's been put into school libraries across the country in an attempt to, again, make stories and narratives about women scientists relatable to young girls who might be looking up ahead and saying, is there someone out there who looks remotely like me, and is this something that I would want to do with my life? But I want to spend a few minutes talking about a complete grassroots effort that was put together by two journalists, Nandita Jayaraj and Ashima Dogra, who decided to take a 2-year project, funded it out of pocket, and now have raised a fund called the Life of Science Project. They decided that every week they would use social media to tell the story about some woman scientist across the length and breadth. And they have, over the last 2 years, online, covered the stories of scientists and introduced us to their lives, their challenges. And in the process, I have ended up knowing much more just by watching them of my own community of people within the country, Indian women scientists. And their insights have been fascinating because many of these tell us about how, you know, they put together such a pressure on on-site daycare that it forced the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, to wake up and decide that they needed to put a daycare into place. And this is purely grassroots, starting from people out in the public, pushing the system sufficiently that you eventually have a rather male-dominated IIT putting together in place a daycare unit. Also, one thing that came out throughout all of their multiple interviews is that a single supportive family member or a mentor is almost essential to all of the stories of these women that have hung on in science. It also tells us that when we talk about fixing the leaking pipeline, we're saving the women, in a sense, who already had a fighting chance. They were privileged. They had access to education in many cases. They had supportive parents, mothers, fathers, grandparents. They had somebody to hold, you know, have their back when their child had to be looked after, somebody who would, a mother-in-law or a mother that would step in and help. It's this set of women that, despite the challenges, somehow end up making it. What about the large masses of women that don't have this access and don't have these opportunities? We're not tweaking the system enough for them. We're only taking the absolute cream that ends up having access to opportunities all along the way. The large mass ends up being left behind, in a sense. And that's something that you hear about over and over again. Also, the absence of women on selection committees for jobs, tenure, promotion, awards, science academy fellowships is prevalent. It's prevalent across the globe. It's prevalent in India. And that's why we have hardly in any women awardees, very few members of science academies. And you get asked questions along these lines. As an example from IIT Hyderabad of a scientist there. This is a serious problem, and part of the reason is because we insist on only tweaking the rules. I really feel we need to go back to first principles and ask, if an award committee is looking and there's not an appropriate nomination of women, then the job of the selection committee is to go out there and actually look a little bit deeper and look a little bit better and look at why their systems are systematically leaving out 50% of the population. What about the others? What about race? What about color? What about other requirements that we just have a very non-diverse representation in science internationally? And that's a problem. And if that's the case, perhaps going back to first principles is going to be necessary, because the minor tweaks may not be enough to really see this change in a dramatic way. And I thought I would end by telling you some of my own stories, because I've been so inspired listening to stories of women who have, it's been amazing getting to know many of you personally. I grew up on a campus. My father is a clinical pharmacologist, my mom's a neuroendocrinologist, and that tells you that I'm from that minuscule sliver of India that is very privileged and has access and opportunities all the way from the very beginning. I grew up on a research center campus, went to graduate school in the US, spent a couple of years in the UK, a year in Sweden, and then went back home where I set up my lab. And I've been very privileged to work with some amazing people. The pay it forward idea is really fantastic, because you can, in a sense, even if you touch a few lives, have that minuscule impact, and then they go on and touch multiple other lives, and you know, that's how it goes. I've been very, very blessed to have mentors. My PhD advisors, both of them, there's no special formula here. Both of them were men, remarkably supportive, and continue to be so multiple years after I left their labs. But I want to end by telling you about two women who've had a dramatic impact on me. The first one is Professor Amy Arnsten, who just last week got elected to the National Academy of Medicine in the US. She was on my qualifying exam committee, and I remember as a young PhD student at Yale looking around and seeing the women in senior positions and thinking, I don't know if I want to be like them, because they're all a little frightening. They all are super aggressive. They seem like they're shadow boxing constantly. And many of them don't have a family life that I would aspire to have. And she was the exception. And it was great that I had her as a role model and a mentor, and she sent me a little note right after I finished my qualifying exam, which is a ritual of sacrifice in a sense in the US, where your neck gets chopped off pretty much. I had 4 men on that committee, 1 woman. The rest, the men said, congratulations, we're very proud of you, we're very good, and that was the end of it. She sent me a card with a little note telling me, go celebrate, enjoy yourself. And that little action of hers might seem very minuscule, but it meant to me that she didn't have to follow the sort of paradigms of what was considered the dominant approach in science. Very neutral, non-personal, we are not going to get, really don't want to get into any personal entanglements. The fact that she reached out, talked to me, and has continued to do it many, many years later. I'm a faculty member back in India. She'd send me a picture of irises or flowers that are growing in her garden, and it's a bond and a relationship that builds over years. This is something that is unique and special to women. It makes the process of doing science richer for having those personal interactions. Neutralizing them only makes the process very, very dry. Marina is again another very inspirational woman. I was very lucky to have her as a mentor. And I will walk away from this meeting feeling like I have had a chance to watch some other amazing mentors. I was blown away by the presentations yesterday from the Saudi scientists. I'm honored to have heard their stories, their examples of how you can completely push boundaries against what really look like insurmountable odds. So thank you very much again to the organizers for this opportunity, and I'll end there.
Our final speaker is Dr. Manal Suerjo, an associate professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at San Diego State University, where she has been a faculty member since 2015 and an affiliate of the Viral Information Institute and the San Diego State University Center for Molecular Biology. She received her PhD in cellular biophysics and X-ray crystallography at Boston University School of Medicine, and has made key discoveries on the origins of life and early evolution of the genetic code. Dr. Suerjo is a recipient of research grant awards from the NIH and NSF. She has published and collaborated nationally and internationally and holds several patents. Please welcome Dr. Manal Suerjo.
We're on board. Welcome, everyone. I wanted to thank the organizers and Dr. Amina Farhan for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I had a fabulous 3 days of intense presence in among powerful women. This room is full of power, and it has been for the past 3 days. And it honors me to be among you experiencing this and sharing my experience too. So what I decided to do is take you on a journey quickly of my career path, which I consider unusual and non-conventional, yet it led to success and it continues to succeed. And on the way, I will take you on stops that highlight proud achievements from my lab, done by my students, or done by me when I was a student, and hope to intermingle that with the ups and downs of life that taught me lessons which also affected my work and affected how I approach success. So I get started. It all started in 1962 when my parents, who were Palestinian refugees, from the Gaza Strip region, particularly from the town of Majd al-Asqalan, which is now part of Israel proper. They met and had the common dream of starting a family and raising highly educated children. So they quickly moved to Kuwait, where we are, and started their life as educators and teachers. And primarily my father, whom I owe all the beginnings of scientific inquiry and knowledge that I acquired in my childhood. Abdelrahman Shukri Suerjo, and it's a picture of him in 1966, the year I was born. giving a lecture in a biology classroom in Kefan High School, which is here in Kuwait. And in the process, he touched many lives and wrote curricula and developed a lot of textbooks for high school education in geology and biology. And I was not an exception. I certainly studied from these texts. This man was the #1 source of inspiration for me, and he is the one who got my back. He's the one who made me that privileged girl who was trusted and whose curiosity was satisfied. I spent most of my childhood touring the Arabian desert, the deserts of Kuwait, collecting rocks and crystals and geodes. He was an avid geologist and a reader and explorer. And he taught me all about the fish in the local shores of Kuwait. He was also a lover of marine life and an ecologist. That, fast forward many, many years, led me to Kuwait University, where I did my undergraduate studies, of all places in the physics department. And this is me in the Kuwait University Physics Lab in the early 1984. And I studied pure physics, and my ambition was to go into astrophysics. And I was actually led down that path by a common passion that I had with my favorite teacher at that time, who is none other than the highly regarded Dr. Amina Farhan. So she gave me a piece of advice. So I graduated in 1988, and I quickly, 1988 and 1989, I take off to the United States, backed by the support of my father, to start my PhD studies in a post-bachelor's PhD program at Boston University. And that time is that's the time when I discovered the living cell. And I fell in love with that microcosm that contrasted very well with my original interests in outer space and macrocosmos. I studied under Barbara Seaton. That was the second most influential woman in my career after Dr. Farhan. And these ladies, as you see, kind of build up my tribe that we've been talking about throughout my career. So I studied membrane biophysics, and that's when I also learned the technique, powerful technique in chemistry called X-ray crystallography. Just shortly after I started my studies, basically a year later, luck started entering my life in much dramatic ways than I expected. It started with a combination of good luck and bad luck. The bad luck was the horrible disaster of 1990, August 2nd, the invasion of Kuwait by the Iraqi troops, which changed my life in many ways. It led to me not being able to come back to see my family and to visit my country. And at the same time, it was a sliver of good luck that was just needed for me at that time to leave, because I was in Kuwait visiting during that invasion time, during those 2-week period. And in fact, it was by sheer coincidence that I took the last flight out of the country on August 2nd, 1990. If I hadn't taken that step, if the stars hadn't lined up right, who knows where my career would have been. But as I take you down that path, you will see that this is not where it ends. The mishaps are many, because life happens. And I learned really the hard way that it's not what happens that determines the outcome, but how you react to it. So the next mishap was also a year later, when I almost got deported from the United States, just due to a complete misunderstanding. And that also affected my prospects, because at the time I had an offer to transfer my studies to Harvard University, something I couldn't do because the United States INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service, had lost my paperwork that proves that I entered the country legally, and they were about to deport me because it was the right thing, because this was the law. Until, again, good luck turned around, and the very man who received me at the Logan Airport in Boston on August 2nd, 1990, and stamped my passport, walked right in front of the office of that woman who was about to send me to the deportation center, and recognized my face a year later and told me, "How are you doing? You're the one who came through Boston on August 2nd, 1990. And that was what spared me the deportation. So it was a turn of bad luck, dramatically, after, from bad luck to good luck. The price, however, was that I was for a year without papers that blocked my ability to take two offers that were dream offers for me at that time. And one of them was to go to Harvard University, to transfer from BU to Harvard University, and the other was beginning of a recruitment to the MRC in England, specifically the Cavendish Lab, which harbors the origins of the field of X-ray crystallography. And that's my field. I can sum it up with a slide, which I actually started learning about right at the physics department at Kuwait University. What we do in X-ray crystallography is we decipher the molecular structure of molecules at atomic resolution. And to do that, it's like taking an image of a molecule, except that it's so tiny you cannot do that on your own. You have to line up tens of thousands of them, all lined up in the same angle, the same direction, so you can image them all at once. And you use X-rays for that, so you can actually capture their size, right? And I depict it here graphically. This technique is 100 years old, and it was developed originally by Lawrence Bragg and his son, who had won the joint Nobel Prize for it, the only example of father and son who won the Nobel Prize together. And the diffraction of X-rays from a crystal is governed by this Bragg's law, which relates the distances between atoms to the angle of diffraction and the wavelength of the light that's diffracted. And basically, you're after that distance. So we apply a mathematical operation, the Fourier transform, in 3 dimensions to calculate the positions of the electrons that diffracted the light. And where there are electrons, there are atoms, and therefore, we basically determine the positions in 3-dimensional real space of each atom in your molecule. The founders of this field is a woman and 2 men who were a source of inspiration for me, particularly the woman, Rosalind Franklin, who was behind the determination of the structure of DNA. These 3 people, Rosalind Franklin, James Watson, and Francis Crick, jointly put their minds in model building and data to really establish what we consider now modern biology, the structure of DNA and how it participates in what we call the central dogma of life. This is a photograph by Rosalind Franklin that I teach about all the time, and it was one of the first things I encountered while I was at Kuwait University in the study of X-ray crystallography. This is a photograph of the diffraction by DNA of X-rays. It has this characteristic X shape, where basically that cross in the middle that indicates that it's a double helix, and it has a repeating pattern. The 4 empty diamonds around the cross indicate that there's a continuity of a unit of a repeating pattern. It doesn't stop. The 2-fold axis indicates that there are 2 strands, 2 molecules really running opposite to each other. And the resolution that yields an information about the structure of the ladder of DNA, right? That I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. These are actually now, these kinds of molecules are now studied at the crystalline level. And these are examples of actual crystals of macromolecules that we grow routinely in my lab. And they are made of true biological molecules, proteins, RNA, and DNA. Except that these crystals give you a lot more sophisticated and complicated diffraction patterns that are a lot more informative. And they can give you such high resolution, up to literally 0.9 angstroms. That's about 1/10 of billionth of a meter in terms of accuracy. And that kind of knowledge can be so powerful, it led the field, and me with it, to explore essential things that are important for humanity and for medicine. The first is pharmaceutical drug discovery, which I also tackled in 1995, studying it specifically under the Egyptian chemist Dr. Shireen Abdelmegid, who had been behind the determination of the crystal structure of the human growth hormone. And he's a well-known chemist in the pharmaceutical industry in the United States. With him, I ended up studying the structural basis of HIV drug resistance. At the time, HIV drugs had come out to the clinic and were being used for the first few years, and resistance to these drugs was emerging. So we found that HIV, in order for it to resist drugs, it changes itself in a way such that it mimics its evolutionary path, the natural path of evolution it actually went through when it converted itself from a virus that infected higher apes to the virus that infected humans, except that it reversed that direction of evolution. This was quite intriguing. What it says basically that the evolutionary pressure that drugs put on the macromolecules they target in HIV is quite similar to the evolutionary pressure that existed in nature out in the jungle. This led me to molecular evolution and the power of using X-ray crystallography to understand the relationship between species at the molecular level, which took me all the way back to the earliest stages of evolution of life on the planet, basically to the origins of life, which lie, in essence, in one key macromolecule, which is transfer RNA, or tRNA. Is that molecule you look at on the right, and it's an L shape. In one tip of the L, which is the bottom tip, the bottom of the page, you see what we call the anticodon. It's the decoding center of this molecule. This molecule reads the genetic code and translates it to the proteins that make up life. So I was interested in how this molecule is made and processed in the cell, the biogenesis of tRNA. We started studying this molecule from organisms that date all the way back to the origins of life on the planet, about 3 billion years ago. And we find these organisms in volcanic vents, such as the one you're looking at here, except that they are hydrothermal vents. They are under the ocean. And they act as isolated ecosystems because the Earth, 3 billion years ago, used to be a giant volcano. And as the volcanic activity calmed down and the Earth cooled down, it left a few cracks under the ocean where the ancient organisms continued to thrive. So we collect these and we consider them live fossils. So studying this RNA from these organisms is literally studying the origins of life on the planet. So this led me to the Scripps Research Institute, which was the peak and golden era of my career. I was surrounded by Nobel Prize winners, by the brightest scientists in the world, from Europe, from Japan, from all over the world, gathering in that highly prestigious environment, well-funded and well-supported with equipment. I made some of my key discoveries there. The structure of the alanine tRNA synthetase, which was one of the key molecules that decode one of the letters of the genetic code. Then, life took a turn for me, and that had to do with balancing family and career. I was married at a time, but my husband wasn't supportive of my career ambitions. So I had to go on the track of compromise. And that is the stage that required grit. So after glory and success and quite a bit of luck against many strange odds, life became real all of a sudden, and grit was about the only thing that can do it. I was offered a dream faculty position at University of Houston, Texas, which I declined, despite the almost $1 million startup budget and big lab and several graduate students. And that's because we couldn't move. So I took the second best offer, which was almost a null offer. The only reason I took it is because it was the closest to where I lived, to home. The practical, analytical me was trying to make things work, and I actually did. So I took a position at Western University of Health Sciences, teaching medical school, medical biochemistry, a subject that I've never taught and never studied, and I had to teach it to myself to be able to teach it. And that's when I really realized that if you do physics, you can do anything. And that's my motto. It's been that way since. They gave me a 400 square foot lab, just about enough for me and one more student. I had on my own just a small grant of $35,000, and I didn't get a startup budget from that institution because it was a teaching institution that was aspiring to build itself as a research institute. The key striking figure here is the 100-mile drive. In California, big distances are nothing. This is just an hour-and-a-half drive from home to work. So making it for 5 years on a tenure-track position to a place where I could get funded and I get a large lab and I can produce real research, real discoveries and publish them, required a lot of organizing and a lot of grit, basically. A lot of powerful communication, concise, powerful, and positive communication. I ran the lab remotely half the week, and I managed to find ways to recruit students and continue to expand the lab over the 5 years. This is the time when I made key discoveries. One of my biggest prides is the discovery of a new biochemical reaction called nitrile reduction. We actually discovered the enzyme, characterized it functionally and mechanistically with a team of collaborators, and the structure of it was determined in my lab. The group grew to 4 students, and they all became master's students who basically graduated with master's degrees. And that's the time when I added to my arsenal of tribe Professor Valérie de Gressy-Lagarde, who you see her picture there, who became a friend and an advocate, and we became very good, strong collaborators. We supported each other. This kind of interaction is extremely important. Only women can do it for each other. And that's when I raised my first major grant from the National Science Foundation. And then I continued with more discoveries of old chemistry and new chemistry in the same pathways of biogenesis of tRNA. Nitrile amidation was one of them. That's another enzyme that we discovered from another source that's extreme environment. And that is basically Mount Solfatara in Italy, where a bunch of rare organisms called Crenoarchaea were isolated. And they live under high sulfur conditions, high temperature. And they also are ancient. They date back to 2.8 billion years. So we also discovered several biochemical pathways in their tRNA biogenesis. And those discoveries made it recently to the cover of the journal Proteins, Structure, Function, and Bioinformatics. We also discovered several drug targets, and that's the beauty about discovering chemistry in microbes, is that these enzymes catalyze reactions that are essential for the life of, let's say, a pathogenic bacteria. And then you can develop them as potential antibiotic drug targets. And that's what happened with one of these enzymes we call FolE2, which turned out to be a good candidate for antifolate antibiotics, which would be a new class of medicines. And that discovery also made it to the cover of the European journal Biochemical J. Things started happening. The 100-mile drive and the remote running of a lab for 5 years started to pay off. And hard work led to the harvest. Several papers on these ancient enzymes led to the NSF grant, but also a major paper we published on a new pathway we discovered in tRNA biogenesis called T6A biosynthesis pathway. The paper you're looking at here, that led to a major NIH grant that really I consider as the beginning of picking the fruits of my effort. And indeed, San Diego State University called me very quickly and said, we need to get you over here, give you real equipment, big lab space. And my group is now, has 9 people in it. And I'm showing here the key players, undergraduate students, graduate students, a couple of postdocs. And this is my group. And another stage, a year later, basically, with some names that I wanted to acknowledge. Dr. Amit Luthra, who comes from India to do a postdoc with me, highly trained young man, Bogusław Stek, who is also from Poland. My tribe, you see it on the right. I want you to notice that it doesn't only have women. It has two men, Shireen Abdelmajid, whom I mentioned, and one of my main collaborators, Dirk Iwata Royal, whom I consider a male feminist. So there are such people. You want to put them also on your side. In a nutshell, I would like to summarize this in terms of the lessons that I learned, and they're all lessons in leadership throughout this. They are really about distinguishing the difference between doing and being. Because we all know what we need to do. You need to be organized. You need to prioritize. You need to delegate. Do. But often, when it comes to leadership, it's the question of who you need to be in a certain moment to react to a certain event, a happening of life. Because that reaction is truly what determines the outcome, and it's not what happens. First thing I learned is that I'm not my circumstances. So I have circumstances, and I'm not them. So that's a good acknowledgement. You don't dismiss the suffering, you don't dismiss the inconveniences, but you don't collapse yourself with them. And then I learned that I'm a creator of my reality, because honestly, once you distinguish you're not your circumstances, there's nothing else to do but create. And you just take off. And then I learned that it's important to keep the possibility alive, meaning stay inspired and continue to inspire others, such as your students. And then execute with passion, like when you do it like you mean it. Don't do it, from the back of your hand, as we say in Arabic, right? And finally, whatever it is, never quit. You will have many projects and many of them will not work. Never say, I'm done with this project. Put it on the back burner. It will come back and benefit you later. And I will take your questions with the panel. Thank you.
So I think everyone will agree with me that this was extremely inspiring talks again from all three speakers. I've certainly taken with me that education is a key, and that's not just education in the schools, but also educating each other. And I think we heard from Dr. Nagaba is, to actually help these women to understand and bring that message forward. I think we also heard a lot about mentorship again, that how important this is, but also that it's not just the policy making that's important, it's also the bottom-up type approach that's important. It's important that we get ourselves involved in all the different issues and bring it up to a level where the policy makers can listen to us and also take it further. So the two-way approach, I think, is also very important. And I think finally we heard actually that whatever it means, that luck has some aspects of this and can actually have an impact on how our career will develop. But the important thing there is not what happens to us, whether it's good luck or bad luck, but how we react to it, and that we keep that sort of inspiring grit feeling in us and keep working, basically. I think that's a very good message. I've been told that we have a little bit, like 5 minutes for questionings, so we have time for that before lunch. So we have one in the first row here.
I think I have the mic here. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists for an excellent and amazing session. And I would like to thank Dr. Manal for a couple of things. First, for mentioning that Rosalind Franklin is the one who first identified the structure of the DNA, while the other scientists received the Nobel Award for the great discovery. And second, for mentioning something that women often don't report, is that whenever at any point in their life there is a sacrifice that needs to be done for the family, it's the woman who does the sacrifice, and she doesn't acknowledge it. And often women choose the less of the better choices assuming that this is the right thing to do for them and for their families. So thank you for pointing these very important points. Thank you.
And we have a question here at the front.
I would like to thank all the members on the, who talked today, because they said wonderful things, and I agree with Dr. Nagwa. I was going to say the same comment. I'm a medical biochemist, and I always teach the Crick and Watson model, and they took the Nobel Prize, and it was the first time for me to know that Frankel was a woman, because they say Frankel model, Frankel said they don't put she, they never put she. So thank you for this, for what have you said.
So thank you for that comment, because the American Chemical Association, the American Chemical Society and the American Crystallographic Association are intent on clarifying that in undergraduate curricula. And I actually make a point of giving a full lecture on it, an hour and 15 minutes, every time I teach general biochemistry every semester, clarifying exactly that photograph 51. By the way, there's a book on that photograph, and there's a play that rotates around the world that's just focused on the value of that photograph in all of modern medicine, basically. So
thank
I was
you.
glad to know
My
that.
other comment is for Dr. Nagwa. You have done wonderful work, and being a member in the National Council of Women, I would like to collaborate with you to disseminate the knowledge that you have said, to give the women confidence and to give them not to feel guilty, and to give them pride that they are looking after these, what we say, the disabled children. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think there's one last question at the back.
There's three more, I see.
Sorry? There's more? At the back there, yeah.
Just I want to add for the contribution of the women, thinking of the enzyme kinetics, the Km value goes for Michaelis, yet the Menton is a lady. She's
Yes.
the one who did the calculation.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's still at the back.
Dr. Manal, thank you very much for your fantastic speech. We all know at the end of your speech, it is all in your hand. It is you who make the difference, the ladies who make the difference. Don't ask the men to recognize you. You have to recognize yourself first and push forward.
You're absolutely right. If you got that and everyone got it, then I think I successfully delivered my message.
Yeah, do I have one comment?
But we need the man. We need him to back up our work. Sure. Thank you.
We have one question on the left over here. There's lots of hands raised here.
Can I? Shall I wait? Okay. I'm not from the field of science, but the last 3 days have been so enriching and so empowering. You women were so fantastic. Professor Vedya, you made me feel so proud. Thank you very much. And that iconic photograph never fails to inspire. I am from print and broadcast media, working in Kuwait for the last 16 years. And I managed to pen a book on Kuwaiti women, and I do work on a show called Gulf Pioneers for Radio Kuwait. And I encountered a problem which I want to relate to what you said about Lilavati's daughters, Professor Vedya, that there is a lack of documentation here regarding the achievements of women in science. And I have failed to get access to enough information here. And if it is possible to look into the matter. And I also wanted to find out from the ladies and the ladies from the Arab world, that as Arab women scientists, and especially when you wear the hijab, do you still face stereotypes? Are you still faced with the problems of stereotyping when you go out for conferences outside the Arab world?
Yeah, I I think they still face this, especially in the Arab countries, still face. And even we faced before when we put a project, but this is 30 years ago, the PI of the project should be a man. And the lady is the co-PI. But now all are changed. But the problem in the Arab, some of the Arab countries, they don't agree to send their daughters or their adults to go to a conference alone. So they send her brother or her caregiver or something like that with her, but not in Egypt. In Egypt, we are all take this freedom. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much to everybody. I'm afraid we're going to have to...
add just one thing?
Well, you have one comment? Yes, sorry.
I just wanted to say, you know, we've been sitting here and listening, and we're, of course, a small privileged group that has access to these stories. It would be phenomenal if KFAS or any of the other organizations that are here put together a compilation of many of the women that we've had the opportunity to listen to their stories, and if that could be online on social media, that would, many stereotypes get challenged when you actually have, you know, preconceived notions go out of the window, and it would be very, very useful to see something like that come up.
Yeah. With that, I'm afraid we're going to have to close this session, and thank you very much for your participation. I would just like to make one very short apology before you leave, before lunch. Coming from Sweden, you might have noticed that the Nobel Prize this year was only given to men. I'm sorry, I had nothing to do with it, but it has been acknowledged a lot in Swedish media, you should know this, and I am pretty sure that next year there will be a woman on that stand as well. So thank you very much.